Excuse me. Excuse me. Could you please tell me what crossed my mind when I picked that fuchsia color? Hi, my name is Isabel and I mostly dress in black. I wouldn't do this shirt in black, but you know, what about some simple, minimal, classic, crisp white? Maybe next time. This is the Antoinette shirt, by the way, or at least one of the combos that you can do with the 3 different sleeves and color designs. For this project, you will need some fabric, poplin if you can. You'll need interfacing as well, woven and thin, some bias tape, 7 to 10 millimeter wide, and 6 buttons. 6, not 5, Isa. First things first, let me show you what the shirt is made of. We've got the back, the front with interfacing on both left and right pieces, the collar, you should have interfacing on both parts, the ruffle strip, the sleeves, and the cuffs. Okay, let's start by making the collar. Take the ruffle strip, fold it in half wrong sides together, and press it down. Fold and cut a notch in the middle. Pin all along and gather. Take the collar, fold it in half and mark the middle with a notch, then pin the gathered strip to the collar, right sides together. Once all the pleats are pinned, sew in the seam allowance. I turn it upside down just to check if I'm happy with the pleats. I pin the other side of the collar, right sides together, and I sew all the layers together while respecting the seam allowance of 1 centimeter. Once it's done, I turn upside down. If you notice anything that might bother you later on, now is the time to adjust the ruffles. If everything is okay for you, trim the seam allowances and set aside. Let us do the bust darts, and here they are after I press them down. We're assembling the front and back parts at shoulder level. I sew, and then I finish the edges with my overlocker. I thought, you know what, let's try and top stitch the collar so that it flattens everything really well. This is the best I could do. It's not super disgusting, but I was not convinced, so I removed it. Just a little experiment in case you're tempted to top stitch as well. So I pin the collar to the neckline. I'm going to sew from one end of the collar to the other. And this is what you should get. Let's add the bias tape, which sole purpose is to hide the seam allowances of the collar. You'll see. So I'm gonna place my bias tape, and there are 2 things to be careful with. First, you want the bias to stick out by about 2 centimeters beyond the tip of the collar. So the very ends of the tape is in the button placket. Second, you want the pleat of the bias tape to be right above the seam that I sewed earlier. So I use a first set of pins to really place my bias tape correctly. And then I use another set to hold the tape in place, and I remove the first set. I'm going to sew 1 centimeter from the edge. I'm going to stitch in the fold of the bias tape on the seam that we made earlier. This is what you should get. I remove all the pins, and what I'll do is cover the seam allowance with the tape. For this, I will first need to cut said seam allowance. Once it's done, I pin the bias in place. Here, before I sew, I want to show you where to start and stop the seam. We're gonna stitch all along the neckline and stop right where the ruffles end. If I flip the fabric, we want the seam to stop here, so that when the collar is down, the seam is hidden. Let's sew. And this is what you should get. Okay, let's now move on to the bottom plackets. Use the notches to know where to fold the plackets. Fold once and then the second time. I have pressed down the 2 folds. I pinned the tip. I am going to stitch while respecting the 1 cm seam allowance. You'll have to be a bit precise to avoid stitching the bias tape width. I'm sewing. Let's have a look. And I have a question here. Why is it blurry? You had one job, Isa. You turn upside down. You cut off a bit of the seam allowance. And you sew the bottom plackets. Here's the result. Moving on to the sleeves. Gather the sleeves, then place the sleeves paying attention to the front and back notches. Then sew. Then finish the edges. And there you go. Flatten the seam allowances towards the shoulders and top stitch. Let us now sew the sides and finish the edges. Now the cuffs. I took out the pattern to show you that there are figures which will help you know which side goes where. So you need to match the figures. Fold the cuffs in half, pin and sew. And I'm gonna open the seam allowances and press them down. I fold the cuffs wrong sides together. I insert the sleeve in the cuff. Notice that my sleeve is on the right side. Place the cuff so that the seam matches the seam of the sleeve under the arm, pin, and sew all around all 3 layers together. After that, finish the edges. And now I'm just gonna have the fabric slide and I'll press down the cuffs in place. This is what you get. For the hem, I'm gonna finish the edges with my overlocker. I hide the threads. Then you fold twice and press down. And you sew. Finally, the buttons and the buttonholes. And this shirt is done. Ah, that was the last one. It feels good. If you make it, don't forget to hashtag it on Instagram, and maybe I'll see you there on Instagram. Meanwhile, you take care. Kiss, kiss, hug, hug. Okay, see ya.